Yorkshire people have always insisted they're different. They'll tell you within 5 minutes of meeting you that they're from Yorkshire, not from England, not from Britain, from Yorkshire. They have their own flag, their own anthem, their own dialect, their own day, and a sense of identity so fierce that outsiders find it baffling. For a long time, that was dismissed as regional pride and stubbornness. But then the geneticists started looking at Yorkshire DNA, and what they found was genuinely surprising, because it turns out the Yorkshire claim to be different from the rest of England isn't just cultural. It's written into the Y chromosome. The blood of the people who live in the hills and dales of Yorkshire carries a heavier mark from across the North Sea than almost anywhere else in England. The Vikings didn't just raid Yorkshire, they stayed, they settled, they married. And over 1,000 years later, you can still see them in the place names, in the words people use, and in the DNA itself. This is why Yorkshire people are genetically different from the rest of England. This is Dust and Stories. Subscribe, because the past doesn't just disappear. Sometimes it's still flowing in the blood. To understand Yorkshire's DNA, you have to start with who was there first. And the first people in Yorkshire were Celts. Before the Romans, before the Angles, before the Vikings, Yorkshire was home to two powerful Celtic tribes. The largest was the Brigantes, one of the biggest tribal confederations in all of ancient Britain, controlling most of what is now northern England from a heartland in Yorkshire. Their name may mean the High Ones or the Hill People. Their queen, Cartimandua, ruled as a Roman client monarch and made one of the most controversial decisions in early British history. She handed over the British resistance leader Caratacus to the Romans in chains. In the east, in what is now the East Riding, lived a separate and very distinctive tribe called the Parisii. They may have been connected to a Gaulish tribe of the same name in France, the people who gave their name to the city of Paris. And the Parisii of Yorkshire had a burial custom found almost nowhere else in Britain. They buried their dead in chariots. Archaeologists have uncovered dozens of these chariot burials in East Yorkshire, warriors interred with their two-wheeled vehicles, sometimes with the horses, sometimes with weapons and joints of pork for the journey to the next world. This practice points to a deep cultural connection with the Celtic world of continental Europe, and it makes the East Riding one of the most important Iron Age archaeological landscapes in all of Britain. These were not primitive people. They were sophisticated, warlike, horse-riding Celts with continental connections living in Yorkshire centuries before the Romans arrived. So Yorkshire began as Celtic. But here's the first surprise the DNA reveals. The Celtic genetic legacy in Yorkshire is weaker than in almost any other part of Britain. In most of Britain, just under a third of men carry a particular ancient Y chromosome lineage nicknamed the Britanni marker, after the earliest recorded name for the Britons. In Yorkshire, that lineage is far less common. Something happened to Yorkshire that didn't happen as intensely anywhere else. Wave after wave of newcomers came across the North Sea, and they didn't just conquer, they replaced. The Romans came first in the 1st century AD. They built their northern capital at York, which they called Iberacum, and it became one of the most important cities in the entire Roman Empire. The Emperor Septimius Severus ran the Roman Empire from York for 2 years and died there in 211 AD, and in 306 AD, when the Emperor Constantius died in York, his son was proclaimed emperor by the legions on Yorkshire soil. That son was Constantine the Great, the man who would legalize Christianity, convert the Roman Empire, found Constantinople, and change the course of Western history more profoundly than almost any other figure of the ancient world. He was declared emperor in York. There is a statue of him sitting outside York Minster to this day, marking the spot. But the Romans, for all their importance, left relatively little genetic mark on the general population. They were an army and an administration, soldiers, officials, and traders, not a mass migration of families settling the land. The mass Migration came next, and it came from across the sea. In the 5th century, as Roman Britain collapsed, Germanic peoples began crossing the North Sea. Angles, Saxons, Frisians, and Jutes from what is now Denmark, northern Germany, and the Netherlands. In Yorkshire, it was primarily the Angles who came. They didn't just raid. They settled in enormous numbers, taking over the land, establishing kingdoms, and pushing the Celtic British to the margins. They created the Kingdom of Deira, centered on York, which later merged with the Kingdom of Bernicia to form Northumbria, at its height one of the most powerful kingdoms in Britain, stretching from the Irish Sea to the North Sea. The Angles gave their language to Yorkshire, the ancestor of English. They gave their place names, all the towns ending in tun and ham and lay. And they gave a substantial chunk of Yorkshire's DNA. But they were not the last to come. And they were not the ones who would define Yorkshire's identity forever. That was the Vikings. In November of the year 866, a massive Viking force known to history as the Great Heathen Army landed in England and marched north. It was not a raiding party. It was an army of conquest made up mostly of Danes with Norwegians, Swedes, and others mixed in. In 867, they captured York. They couldn't pronounce the Anglo-Saxon name Eoforwic, so they renamed the city Jórvík. And Jórvík became the capital of a Viking kingdom that would dominate Yorkshire for nearly a century. This is the heart of the story, because the Vikings who took York didn't just install a king and leave. They settled. In huge numbers. They brought their families, they farmed the land, they divided up the territory, and gave their own names to the places they took. They established a separate legal and cultural zone across the eastern half of England, known as the Danelaw, a region stretching diagonally from London to Chester, where Norse law, Norse customs, Norse weights and measures, and the Norse language held sway in place of Anglo-Saxon equivalents. The very word law in English comes from Old Norse. The Danelaw had its own legal traditions so distinct that the boundary between it and Anglo-Saxon England functioned almost like a border between two countries. And Yorkshire was the beating heart of the Danelaw. The boundaries of the historic county of Yorkshire, the boundaries that survived until 1974, are roughly the boundaries of the old Viking kingdom of Jórvík. The density of Scandinavian settlement in Yorkshire was higher than almost anywhere else in England. The evidence is everywhere once you know how to look. Yorkshire place names are saturated with Old Norse. Every town ending in by, Whitby, Selby, Grimsby, Wetherby comes from the Norse word for a village or settlement. Every thorpe, Scunthorpe, Cleethorpes, comes from the Norse for an outlying farm. Every thwaite comes from the Norse for a clearing. Every kirk comes from the Norse for a church. The map of Yorkshire is, quite literally, a map drawn by Vikings. And it's not just the place names, it's the words people still use every day. When a Yorkshireman says lake instead of play, he's using the Old Norse leka. When he says beck instead of stream, that's the Norse becker. When he says gate, to mean a street. As in the famous York Street Coppergate or Stonegate, that's the Norse gata. When he calls his children bairns, that's Norse. The Yorkshire dialect is one of the most direct surviving links to the language of the Vikings anywhere in the English-speaking world. People in Yorkshire are speaking fragments of Old Norse without even realizing it, but the deepest evidence is in the blood. In 2012, a major DNA study examined the Y chromosomes of Yorkshire men, the genetic material passed down directly from father to son, generation after generation, largely unchanged. The results made headlines. The study found that genetic markers associated with Germanic, Scandinavian, and Norse Viking ancestry made up around 52% of Yorkshire's Y chromosome lineages, compared to roughly 28% across the rest of Britain. In other words, by this measure, the male bloodline of Yorkshire was nearly twice as North Sea as the rest of the country. The men who walk the streets of Leeds and York and Sheffield today carry, in many cases, the direct paternal line of the Angles and Vikings who crossed the sea over 1,000 years ago. Now, I want to be honest here because the science is more complicated than the headline. Not every study agrees on the exact numbers. Some more conservative studies, looking specifically at the clearest Norwegian Viking markers, have found lower figures, in the range of 7 to 10% for the most narrowly defined Viking Y chromosome signatures, with a stronger Celtic presence in West Yorkshire than in the East. The reason for the disagreement is that it's genuinely difficult to separate Angle from Dane from Viking in the DNA, because all of these peoples came from overlapping regions around the North Sea and shared a great deal of ancestry to begin with. What everyone agrees on is the direction of the finding. Yorkshire carries a heavier genetic mark from across the North Sea, from the Germanic and Scandinavian world, than most of the rest of England. The Celtic baseline that dominates places like Wales and Cornwall is diluted in Yorkshire by centuries of settlement from the east. The exact percentage is debated. The pattern is not. There is also a fascinating piece of evidence buried in the female line. DNA is passed down two ways: the Y chromosome from father to son, and mitochondrial DNA from mother to child. When researchers looked at the mitochondrial DNA of Yorkshire people, the deep maternal ancestry, they found something remarkable. A large majority of Yorkshire's maternal lineages arrived extraordinarily early, right at the end of the last ice age, around 11,500 years ago, as the first hunter-gatherers walked into a newly habitable Britain across a land bridge that no longer exists. So the picture that emerges is layered and strange. The deep maternal roots of Yorkshire are ancient, Ice Age hunter-gatherers. The paternal lines are heavily overwritten by waves of men arriving from across the North Sea, Angles, Danes, and Norwegians. Yorkshire's DNA is a record of who came, who stayed, and who did the settling. And then there's Jórvík itself, the Viking city. When archaeologists excavated the Coppergate site in York in the late 20th century, they uncovered an astonishingly well-preserved Viking Age city, and recent analysis of human remains from Viking Age York revealed something that complicates the simple story of Scandinavian settlers even further. The people of Jórvík were not all Scandinavian. The city was a cosmopolitan trading hub with genetic ancestry pointing to Scandinavia, yes, but also to the British Isles, to Ireland, to southern Europe, and even further afield. Viking York was an ethnically diverse melting pot, a place where Norse settlers mingled with local Anglo-Saxons, with traded slaves from Ireland and beyond, and with merchants whose goods came from as far away as the Middle East and Central Asia. The Vikings weren't a pure race that replaced everyone. They were the engine of a great mixing, and Yorkshire was the crucible. So what does it all mean? It means that the Yorkshire sense of being different isn't just talk. The county sits on a genuinely distinctive genetic foundation, shaped by being the most heavily settled corner of the Danelaw, the Viking heartland of England. The fierce independence, the blunt directness, the refusal to be lumped in with the rest of the country, Yorkshire people have been telling the world they're different for 1,000 years. And the Vikings who renamed their capital, drew their map, seeded their dialect, and settled their valleys are a large part of the reason why. The next time someone from Yorkshire tells you, within 5 minutes of meeting them, that they're from Yorkshire and not from anywhere else, don't roll your eyes. They might be more right than they know, because under the flat caps and the dry humor and the tea, there's a 1,000-year-old inheritance from across the North Sea. The Brigantes were there first. The Romans crowned an emperor at York. The Angles brought the language. But it was the Vikings who left the deepest mark, in the names on the map, in the words in the mouth, and in the blood in the veins. Yorkshire isn't just a county. It's the last kingdom of the Danelaw, still insisting 1,000 years later that it is not like the rest. If this video showed you a Yorkshire you didn't know existed, subscribe to Dust and Stories. We trace the blood, the names, and the buried history of the places that refuse to be forgotten. Like the video, drop a comment telling us where your family comes from and whether there's a Viking hiding in your bloodline. And thank you for watching. We'll see you in the next one.